Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 2 of Cloud Coffee Break, the series where I help you learn more about cloud computing and serverless. So, in episode 1, I gave the briefest of introductions to serverless computing, and I also showed you how to develop and deploy a very small Hello World application that was implemented using serverless techniques. Now, some fun stuff about that little app that we made. Despite it being entirely defined by a 19-line long YAML file, it actually satisfied a whole bunch of interesting features of building applications in a serverless way. So first of all, that application can scale to thousands of concurrent users, which is quite shocking. It is highly available in that if any of Amazon's availability zones go down within a region, then that application will carry on still running. And also, it only costs money when we're using it, which is basically no one's using it right now, so it's not costing any money. But we're not paying anything up front to constantly be running that app. And all of these are really interesting elements to building and running applications in a serverless way. Okay, so what I'd like to do for the next few episodes in this series is to gradually put together an application as we might do if we're actually working in a real company. And what that means is thinking of not just the underlying serverless technologies, but also all of the technical processes that come with software engineering as well. And so in this episode, I'm going to be kicking that off by looking at an area near and dear to my heart, which is testing. So testing in this context is about writing automated scripts that we can run before we deploy an application. And typically we run these tests from our own development machine or as part of an automated process. Now, testing can also mean things like canary testing, validating our application in a production context. But I don't mean that at the moment. I'm talking about these things that we do before we release the hounds. I think using serverless techniques is quite a significant change in how we think about architecture. Surprisingly, however, it doesn't really change how we've been thinking about automated testing over the last 15 to 20 years. Now, one particularly useful model over this time, over these 15 to 20 years, has been the idea of the testing pyramid. And what it does is it communicates that we want to put most of our testing effort into unit tests, very quick tests that we run with our code in the same process. The pyramid expresses this idea that we want to put more effort on unit tests than other types of tests because the unit test part is the widest point in the pyramid. At the top of the pyramid, on the other hand, we have end-to-end tests, and these are sometimes called integration tests, that run our application as a whole. These tests are expensive to maintain, and they take a lot longer to run, and so we only want a small handful of these. And then in the middle, we have functional tests, which is a term that I will admit is a little bit fuzzy. So the way that my business partner and I think about functional tests is that they are run a lot like unit tests in that the tests and the code are all in one process. But functional tests test as much of the complete application as possible rather than just individual functions. An important thing for me when I think about these different types of tests is that unit and functional tests are checking that our code works as expected, but that the end-to-end tests validate the assumptions that we're making about how our code interacts with the larger environment. So bringing this around to serverless, for unit tests and functional tests, the area of serverless that we care about is serverless functions, which is Lambda if we're using AWS. And the great news about Lambda functions is that they are very amenable to unit tests, since they are just code. There's no framework anywhere with Lambda. And so another way of putting that is that all that makes a Lambda function is that it has a particular method signature. So that means unit and functional testing for Lambda functions are pretty much the same as unit and functional testings for other types of applications. For end-to-end tests, what John and I recommend is deploying your full application to the cloud. And that's not too different to different types of application either. There are some nuances here and also some slight differences about how we think in comparison with some other folks in the serverless community, but I'm going to talk about those in a future episode. If, on the other hand, you want to know more about that stuff sooner rather than later, I actually wrote an article this week about serverless and testing, and you can find that on the Symphonia blog, and I also provide a link to it in this episode's notes. Okay, let's move on to some code. So as I said at the beginning, what I'm hoping to do over the next few episodes is gradually evolve a small application. Now, I'm calling this application Coffee Store, which is the idea of building a theoretical online e-commerce site. One fun thing I've done is to make the code repository for this public. It's on GitHub at Symphonia Cloud/Coffee Store. Now, if you go there right now, it's going to look a little different to this screenshot. Don't worry, I'm going to explain why. The first commit I made to this repo was to add the very same template.yaml file from episode 1. And if you go to the repo in GitHub, you'll see a release tag named episode-1, which is the repo at this point. In this episode, I want to add a test though, so we need to make some changes. The first thing I need to do is extract the code to a separate source file so that I can run a unit test against it. For this to continue to deploy with the sam deploy command, I update the template YAML to A, change the source location to a place on disk rather than in line, and B, to change the handler property to point to the correct file name, which is api.js in our case. And this becomes the next commit to the repo. So now we can add a test. Nearly. So first of all, a quick discussion about language and tools. I'm doing all of this for now in JavaScript. Now, I'm not a huge JavaScript expert. I know enough to cause myself some trouble. But a nice thing about using JavaScript for these examples is that it doesn't require any compiling and its packaging is fairly simple. On the tooling side, I'm using NPM, and for testing, I'm using Jest. These are the examples that AWS provide in their own templates, and so I'm just sticking with them for now. And again, this is just for now. If we need to evolve these or want to evolve these in future, we can very simply. So in order to write and run tests, we need a testing library and tool, and now we need to introduce a project metadata file so that we can get that testing tool. For NPM, that means having a package.json file, and so this is the initial package.json that I'm starting with. And now we can write our test. Here it is on the left with the code that it's testing on the right. Let's drill into the test code a little. We start by referencing the Lambda's source code file. For unit tests in more complicated projects, we'll likely refer to more nested elements within the project, but for now, we can test the Lambda function directly. On line 5, we actually call the Lambda function, passing an empty event. Now, Lambda functions always take a JSON event, but since we're ignoring that event in our real code at the moment, we can just leave the event here as an empty map. We wait for the function to complete, and then we capture the response in the variable name result. Many real usages of Lambda, for example, ones driven by message queues, don't actually return any value at all. But we have a Lambda function that's triggered by API gateway. And in this case, it needs to return a specific structure of a result and specific values within it for what we want. And so we verify the result of the Lambda function here on lines 7 to 12. Now, in more complicated tests, especially once we start thinking of functional tests, we're probably going to be wanting to think about mocks and stubs and things like that, but we don't need to do any of that at this moment because we have a very simple example. So now we can run our test. And to do that, we run npm install to download Jest, and then we run npm test to actually run the test. Oh no, it failed. How could that have been? Well, that's because the assertion didn't quite match up to what the function is returning. Now, I always like having a new test fail before it passes, and that's so that I can just be doubly sure that the test is correctly hooked up properly. So that's what I've done here is we had a failing test, but now we can change the code and rerun. And yay, it works now. Finally, I can commit these changes, and I also created a new tag named episode 2. And again, you can go to this public repo called Coffee Store and look at this code there for yourself. So that wraps things up for this episode. Today, I introduced what testing means in the world of serverless, and I also created a new app called Coffee Store, which you can go and look at on GitHub. That took our code from last week, our Hello World app, and then I added a unit test to that application as well. So one great way to keep track of new episodes as I make these is to subscribe on YouTube, which should be down there somewhere. And finally, here's a link to this week's resources. I hope you've enjoyed this episode, and I will see you next time. Bye.